Hi, it's Jamie Flinchball here with another episode of People Solve Problems podcast. I am the host and the author of the book by the same name. And today we have with us my good friend Mark Graban. How you doing, Mark?
Hi, Jamie. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm wonderful. So Mark is an author, a speaker, consultant. He's the host of My Favorite Mistake podcast, and author of a new book out now called The Mistakes That Make Us, which
Yeah.
is based on all the many conversations he's had through that particular podcast. Besides that, he's a good friend. We share another podcast together called Lean Whiskey, and always look forward to chatting with him. So
Yeah.
Mark, first, this is a new book. You've had several books out, and I'm really excited. I've not read this yet, but we've talked about it several times in the build up. So tell us about the mistakes that make us.
Mhm.
What's it all about? Why'd you write it?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jamie. It evolved to the point where I would say it's inspired by the podcast series, My Favorite Mistake. Many of the stories from the different podcast guests, our mutual friend David Meyer, for example, former Toyota person who started a distillery in Kentucky. There's great stories from him about this theme of learning from mistakes. Not just as individuals, but the book evolved really to be, I would call it a management book. It's about organizational culture. How do we create a culture? How do we cultivate a culture? That's the word, the subtitle, My Mistake. That evolved too. How do we
Right.
cultivate workplaces? How do we cultivate a culture of learning and innovation? Right. So David's story and other stories from other parts of Toyota, other decades, companies like KaiNexus that I've been involved in, other companies that have this culture that instead of reacting to mistakes in a punitive, blaming way, reacts in ways that really make learning possible, right? So that allows us, that's a form of problem solving. When there's a mistake, we can learn from it. We can prevent that mistake from coming back. That's one great benefit. But then when we have this culture that recognizes, especially when we're doing new things, whether that's process improvement or attempts at innovation, there are going to be mistakes. And if you demand perfection, if you demand every experiment to work out as you predicted, that's not really an experiment. That's not how you get innovation, right? So we don't want people to be terrified of admitting we made a mistake or we tried something and the assumption turned out not to be true. Those are things that I think the book has good guidance for leaders, individually and with their teams and with their companies, of how to really make sure that's in place to create it, or I should say to cultivate it, to strengthen and nurture something that might already be growing in your company.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think a lot of us look forward to reading that. Really, really interesting take, especially around learning new things and
Mhm.
how we experience learning in that vein. So some people might say that whether it's good lean practices or it's good problem solving practices, that fewer mistakes will happen, and
Right.
so therefore mistakes are maybe an indicator of the lack of good process, lack of good work design, lack of good problem solving.
Mhm.
So, what's the counter to that? What would you say to that?
There's different sides to this, right? So in the book, I certainly I think it's a very pragmatic, realistic view of, none of us are perfect as individuals or teams or companies. We all make mistakes. Now, I'm not saying we should just shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's human error. What can we do about it? We can do things about it. One is on the culture side, make it safe for people to admit a mistake and then react in a constructive way. But then at the same time, we should be working to mistake proof our processes in our systems, right? So I'm not saying, well, all mistakes should be shrugged off as learning opportunities. Well, there are certain mistakes that could be fatal, whether that's in a factory or in healthcare. I'm not being flippant about mistakes, but there's the two sides, or there's many sides to the coin here. I'm making a mistake in my analogy. We should try to prevent mistakes, but then at the same time realize we're probably unlikely to have perfect error proofing or mistake proofing. So then when mistakes happen, we should react constructively to try to then improve the mistake proofing. Instead of saying that person screwed up, we might frame it as we've found a problem with our mistake proofing attempt. There was something we didn't anticipate, or in some cases it was too easy to circumvent the mistake proofing, which I would argue that's still a system problem. And some people I know would argue with me about that. We realize, we all make mistakes. That's why we need to error proof. Then when mistakes still happen, people need to feel safe to point it out, to admit it, knowing they're going to get a constructive response, so that we can then kind of cycle it back. The problem solving cycle in this case would include improving our systems so that mistake is either now hopefully impossible to recreate, or because we've learned something much more difficult to repeat. So there's another lesson from the book, comes from a lot of the stories from my guests and from some of my own experience. Learning from small mistakes prevents big catastrophes. Not always, but I'd rather learn from small process problems that didn't hurt somebody, because then if we ignore it and we're dismissive and say like, well, nobody got hurt, there's no problem to solve.
Right.
We know in a lean environment, people would take near misses and risk factors seriously. And, those are opportunities to learn so that we can prevent something worse from happening.
Yep. So let me go back to that point you made around the culture of being able to admit a mistake, right? Mm-hmm. So acknowledging that mistake is there's sort of an impact on that. So if we do admit that mistake, what happens next? There's an impact on the person, and there's an impact on the problem, right? Or an impact on the mistake,
right?
Because of that admission and the response to it. So talk to me about both sides of that. What about what's the concern around the impact on the person, and what's the concern around the impact on the mistake?
Yeah. So there's maybe two ways of looking at it. One is on the people side and the process side, and it's interconnected. But there's the emotional reaction to making a mistake. When it's a mistake, I've heard people use this phrase that's redundant, say, well, it was an unintended mistake. Like, well, by definition,
right,
it was unintended. If it was intended, like that's probably more like sabotage, right? In assault, or some word like that, right? But unintentional mistake, somebody is going to feel bad already, right? So this is where piling on and yelling or punishing, I'm not convinced that does anything but guarantee that more errors are going to happen, because now people are going to feel less psychologically safe to admit a mistake or to point out somebody else's mistake. There's another component, and some of this is through experience I lived through at KaiNexus, reacting to a systemic mistake where some companies might have blamed some other person for quote unquote their mistake. There was a reminder, and there's some good guidance that comes from Karen Ross, who's been a guest on my podcast, and she has a book, The Kind Leader. She really helped me put my head around the difference between nice and kind.
Yes.
Where nice might, and I see some organizations do this in healthcare, like it's better in some way, maybe better than punitive. Instead of being punitive, they're being nice. So, well, Jamie, I know you didn't mean to do that, and it's not your fault, and it's a systemic problem, and I hope you're okay, and we'll get you some counseling services. Like, okay, maybe the counseling services part is getting closer to kind, because kind is really more a matter of constructive and helpful, right? Where nice might just be focused on making the person feel better, or even to the point of where I'm going to look the other way because, Jamie, you made a mistake, but it didn't hurt anybody, and I don't want you to feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of nice, I think, is counterproductive in different ways than punitive can be counterproductive. So I think, a kind approach can be challenging without being disrespectful. I think a kind approach, I think the kindest thing is collaborating with people to make sure the mistake doesn't happen again, right? We don't want an environment like, I think some organizations have focused on psychological safety without also focusing on problem solving, right? So we don't want people repeatedly making and reporting the same mistake and getting a nice response over and over again. The kind approach helps people with the problem solving of, great, now that you've spoken up, we're going to work together to do something about it. And I think that's, ultimately the best response to a mistake. You've got to let someone have their moment of feeling bad, but I think the way you let them get past that is then moving forward and being constructive with the problem solving. I think you shouldn't be dismissive and tell someone, hey, don't be upset. Like that never works, right?
No, that's human nature, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like deny your human nature. It's
Mm-hmm.
don't let your being upset affect your judgment of what happens next. I think that's a probably better way to say it, but don't be upset is not really fair.
Yeah.
Now,
And I was just gonna have one other thing. Like, I mean, our training and our background and the logical part of our brain might be wanting to jump into root cause analysis and jump into the problem solving right away, because it's better to do that when the situation is fresh.
sure.
That said, giving someone a little bit of space instead, before asking, how could that have occurred? We might ask, how are you feeling? How are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe tomorrow is the right time to do the root cause analysis if it's not an ongoing life or death situation.
Right. No, and nobody wants to dwell. So this is actually, relates to the question I was about to ask, which is the transition from providing psychological safety,
Mm-hmm.
not that we move away from psychological safety, but into problem solving, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, part of it, just a couple weekends ago, I was out with I had one car out. I was having coffee with someone. I had to get out of a parking garage, swipe my credit card, threw my wallet on the passenger seat. Got home, had to take another car out to put gas in it. Got halfway there, realized the wallet was still in the passenger seat of the car. So I came home, opened the garage door, closed it, left, and later I asked my wife, did you hear me open the garage door? Like, because you didn't say anything. I thought you would have been like, what'd you forget? Right. But it was sort of like, even we don't want to admit that, yeah, I totally screwed up. And it was a small, not
Mm-hmm.
very costly error,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it is part of that transition that we go from, okay, what happened? Can we say it out loud? Then do we go to, go into problem solving?
Mm-hmm.
So is it, in terms of the transition, you mentioned timing, so
Mm-hmm.
that's a factor. What about, method or different roles, or what are other mechanisms or means to, besides just delay? That's one method you already introduced,
Yeah.
but what are other methods to make that transition from
Yeah.
psychological safety around the mistake into problem solving?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's good to give reassurance and remind somebody that, look, this isn't simply your fault. You're not being punished. We want you to participate in the problem solving. But that's where you have to make sure then you're going from, the comforting response to the constructive action
Mm-hmm.
when that person feels ready. And I think involving, and you have to be careful about the language. You might be quick to say, quote, the person who made the mistake. Like that's usually not the right precise way to say it. You might say the person who was involved in that mistake. They were there at the point of occurrence, but it wasn't their fault. So I think, we do have to be a little bit careful about the language. I mean, we can acknowledge the impact of a mistake, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can take a minute and state facts of, this really impacted a customer. This had, I mean, we don't need to downplay the impact, but I think we can do so in a way that's motivating the problem solving of why this is important to work on, and not be in that mode of I think a lot of organizations make a mistake of punishing the mistakes with the bad outcome, right? And it shouldn't be totally based on the outcome. Like, I'll bring it back to healthcare again. This is an example. Greg Jacobson from KaiNexus, the CEO there, who's an ER doctor, shared an example of a process problem that could lead to a patient being given the wrong dose of ibuprofen, like the difference between 40 milligrams and 20 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's probably, speaking as an engineer here, my recollection would be that's probably not going to kill anybody.
Right.
But I think the best problem solving organizations and those with the highest levels of psychological safety would allow somebody to self-report, hey, we caught it. We almost gave the wrong dose of ibuprofen to the patient. Let's problem solve that.
Mm-hmm.
Where did the process break down? Not because there was a bad result, but recognizing whatever led to that problem that was thankfully caught that time. We can't guarantee it's always going to get caught in the future. That same failure mode, if you will, could then next time lead to a mix-up in medications that could be harmful or deadly. So we've got to take advantage of those opportunities to learn and improve. Maybe did I get too sidetracked from your question?
No, but I think it takes me to the next step around making that transition. I've always been curious about sort of the using rules and processes to sort of make it easier to go do what you should do, because then you don't have to make a decision. And if you're making a decision about, well, should we problem solve this? The easiest rule is, well, did it have a big impact? Which, to your point, probably not the best rule to be using for should we do problem solving. Is just, oh, well, it had a big impact, so therefore we should do problem solving.
But I think you could modify that criteria to did it or could it?
Yes. That's a big difference, right?
Could this potentially have a big impact? But I'll think back to an example, and I blogged about this the other day. Not a life or death mistake. It was at Starbucks, right? I mean, it took them 3 tries to make my drink properly, and it almost came down to a 4th attempt, other than I was watching that 3rd time and the manager trainer was watching. But the cost to Starbucks was dumping 2 beverages at a retail price of $5, whatever the margin is, that's their loss, and the time or whatever delay it was causing for other customers. Is that worth problem solving? Like, that's a judgment call. Mm-hmm. And the barista very pleasantly said, I mean, she apologized, which is good, but not enough. Like, Starbucks should be learning from that mistake in that store. And there's this question of she said, oh, it's my 2nd day. And I thought, are they skimping? Are they making a mistake? Are they skimping on training by saying oh, we'll just point out every mistake she makes and she's going to learn from them? Like, that might, I don't, it's a judgment call of what's most cost effective, but I would make an argument for don't put the barista through that. Like, these are all preventable errors. If they had trained her how to make a nitro cold brew coffee, which is as simple as put cup under tap, turn on tap, don't dump ice in it. Like, that was the one mistake. I mean, there's this question of can we try to problem solve all mistakes if we're spreading out the problem solving responsibility? Is that something for the barista to be involved in, or maybe that's more like a management mistake?
Yeah,
the store manager and a district manager to be involved in. So
So let me ask on, because within that there's sort of a decision around both how much energy we put into and how much do we allow, trying to prevent mistakes, right? Mistake proof. Let's go anticipate where the mistakes are and put a bunch of energy into that, versus allowing mistakes to be the sort of sharp edge of the learning curve. I was recently reading a little sort of micro history around some very famous jazz musicians, and many of them couldn't even read music. They just learned through mistakes, right? They just kept playing and learned what worked and learned what didn't work and experimented their way through it.
Mhm.
And they would continue to experiment with live shows, right? Because the next night will sound a little different.
Yeah.
And those are the musicians that really became top, right?
Mm.
But they
Mhm.
also couldn't play classical music.
Right.
And the way to learn classical music is this is the right way to play it, and you practice it and get it right. And
Yeah.
so there's sort of a contrast there. Like, is the barista learning how to be the best coffee maker in the world, or are they learning to meet the standard of Starbucks?
Yeah.
And so I'm a little off track on the, going
Well,
down that tangent, but how do you make that decision between learn our way to success versus
yeah.
anticipate and prevent?
Mm. I mean, so it's a cop out answer on my part. I'll say it seems very situational, right? So back to the Starbucks example, real quick. There are probably some mistakes that that trainee could make that might be a real allergy issue,
Mm-hmm.
or a customer, like, or if somebody is lactose intolerant or has a dairy allergy and they get whole milk instead of oat milk,
Right.
that would have a higher impact. But like, in the book, I give a very light introduction to a method, and a lot of your listeners might know, wonky language being what it is, failure modes, effects analysis,
Mm-hmm.
of kind of teaching people to, if we have to prioritize and or proactively think through mistakes that could happen, you can use that FMEA methodology to basically think through what's the likelihood of a mistake, what's the severity of that mistake, and what's the detectability of that mistake. And there's a little bit of subjectivity of assigning numbers to those dimensions, and then you go multiply those three numbers together, and then you sort the list, and that would help you prioritize
Mm-hmm.
if you've given the right assignment to likelihood, severity, detectability. Severity, to me, getting the wrong milk, not a problem. Severity to somebody else, really bad, right? So you do think about worst case severity, that it could kill a customer to an extreme point. I think that might be one tool that helps. What do you think about
No,
trying to
I
do
think I think
that?
you're exactly right. It is how severe is the risk of the mistake, and we both know the lean startup world a bit, and we talk about the minimum viable product, the
Mhm.
MVP. Just get something built and put it out there, and that's fine if you're building a way for somebody to find new music they like. But if you're building software that helps banks do transactions, you better
Mm.
be sure it works securely, right?
Or if it's equipment that promises to test people's blood with a finger stick.
like
Mm.
like like that, yes. so
Yeah.
so I think the risk is understanding the situation, and that's, I think, the leadership job at hand,
Yeah.
is understanding that balance and
Yeah.
making good decisions around the
Yeah.
balance.
Yeah.
So
And in the book, I cite and mention there's helpful thinking from Amy Edmondson, who's one of the thought leaders, researchers, writers around psychological safety. And she's lays out this very clear framework of like three types of mistakes. And I don't know if this is the exact language, but basically like mistakes that are happening within a routine process that really just should not happen. Like,
mhm,
we know there's a risk and we know how to prevent it, and there's that. And then there's a middle ground of like, well, circumstances were different, and here's a mistake we didn't anticipate, and oh crap, something happened. And then there's a third category, which is more of like, the frontiers of innovation. This is like lean startup entrepreneurship space around, we know we're doing something new. And this is a point that I hope comes through clearly in the book, like understanding the difference between what we know, like, I know we could go do this, let's implement that, versus I have a hypothesis, I'm making certain assumptions and stating that out loud and going and testing the
mhm,
assumption.
yep,
And it turns out that's not just innovation thinking, that's also good continuous improvement thinking, of not being so stuck on, well, I know, as opposed to saying, let's go test it and see, recognizing we're going to quote unquote make mistakes, or there will be a gap between what we predicted and what actually happened. So let's recognize that that's possible. Let's make it safe to admit. If you're a startup, hopefully your board or your investors are on the same page with you there. Recognizing, look, there are certain environments where making a mistake is almost welcomed, where there's certain situations where we should really focus on making sure a mistake is impossible for someone to make.
Yeah.
Which is different than saying, hey, just be careful. Like I always cringe at the LinkedIn discussion around, something I'll post on medication errors, and people come out of the woodwork, sometimes nurses, to say, well, they should have just read the label. And my argument to that is like, if that line of thinking was effective, it would have already been effective by now.
Yes. Yep. I think you're right. So, well, we'll wrap up there. I really appreciate you sharing, a little bit about your book, The Mistakes That Make Us, sort of a different lens that illuminates where problem solving can help learning, and where mistakes can help with problem solving. And so, great sort of a lot of connective tissue between those two topics. So appreciate you sharing. Wish the book all the success, and I hope our listeners will go out and buy and read a copy. So thanks, Mark, for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jamie. I hope people will go and read it, or later this year, TBD, they can listen to it. I'm going to do an audiobook version of it as well.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with all that. We'll link to it in the show notes. And until next time, see you all later.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the People Solve Problems podcast. Let's keep the conversation going. Visit JFlinch.com for more episodes and other content. And continue to join us on your podcast app, of course. We greatly appreciate your feedback through reviews and ratings. Consider expanding your understanding of problem solving with Jamie's book, People Solve Problems: The Power of Every Person, Every Day, Every Problem. Available on Amazon. Until next time, keep learning, innovating, and solving problems.